And there we are. There's something wrong with that intro. I used to have a better edited version that, you know,
Right.
it didn't just drop right into it. But I am so lazy that I've had to restream for like 4 months, and I haven't rewired that because who cares? Anyway, we got you should probably introduce yourself to.
Should I? Yeah, of
Tell
course.
us.
Yeah, my name is Dan Nicholson. I am happy to be back talking to Speed of Sound. I think it's our third conversation. And by training, I'm a molecular and cell biologist who didn't like the lab, so I turned to the dark side of history and philosophy of science, and never looked back. I've been concerned with the conceptual foundations of the life sciences professionally, and I do sort of integrated work at the intersection of history and philosophy of science, and interested in many different topics and questions. So I don't know if I can give a summary. So I'm happy to talk about whatever comes up. Very curious to hear what we're going to talk about.
Yeah. Well, the first thing you brought up this seminar or whatever, or gathering that you went to in upstate New York on phenomenology, or like.
Yeah. So they call it a Goethean science or Goethean approach to science. It's they're basically unhappy with orthodox mechanistic approaches to life, and they think that what we need is a different approach, one that complements what we have and that provides sort of a first-person engagement with it, right? So a lot of one thing that was very strange that we did, that has never happened in any meeting that I've ever attended, is that they halfway through the first morning, the organizer just brought a plant to the table where we were all meeting around. There were like 8 of us, and we were around a large table, and brought a bunch of plants, and then gave everyone a little, some flowers to observe, and we did this sort of session of collectively observing these flowers and thinking about what we feel what we notice when we look at the flowers, and then we had a discussion. It was very, very unusual, So normally always thinking in the abstract. And then the second day, we went even further, and they showed us we went to this dark room with a microscope, which was projected on the screen, and we saw some hydra from a local pond and stentor, these small organisms almost visible to the naked eye, and we were just poking them and seeing how they reacted. So I mean, I've never encountered something like that. It was a bit like returning to the classroom,
Right.
But it's not what I do, but I definitely appreciated that. Kind of an interesting thing to try to do, to inform your understanding of life, to engage with it directly, personally, to be aware of what you're sensing, and in that sense, it's phenomenological.
When you think about it, you have all these conferences on anthropology and primates and plants, and we never invite a plant to be present, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah. That was exactly the idea. Yeah.
No chimpanzee. Yeah. God, I said I wasn't going to mention this again, but I had an experience when I was 20 years old. I was watching a stentor under a microscope for 4 hours. And of course, I was taking LSD at the time. And I watched it for 4 hours. And right in the middle of it, my water evaporated under my cover slipped, and it just froze, and it killed the stentor. And I cried. And it was like a horrible loss because I knew this guy so well.
Right.
Watching what he was doing.
Yeah.
It was, and then the quick crystallization when it froze was just, beautiful at the same time as being very tragic.
Right.
But my little pet died right in front of me because I was observing him for way too long, heating him up.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, it's we were talking about agency, you see. So you have a bunch of people talking in very abstract terms about what does it mean to be an agent, and then we are confronted with the very entities that we're talking about.
Right.
And it's interesting to see the extent to which the tools that biology has are sufficient to do justice to the experience that you have when you observe these, right?
Yeah.
I mean, is biology already at a, one would hope that biology is at a stage of development that it has the resources to that are consistent with our experience of other organisms, that we have a way of thinking scientifically about agency.
Yeah.
And yet that really isn't the case. That's what makes it so interesting. There isn't really no theory of agency in biology. In fact, most biologists would even say that we don't even need a theory, right? So yeah, against that background, it was a very sort of inspiring experience. Yeah.
Well, if you look at a dandelion seed in the wind, how it darts around and stuff, it has a certain intelligence and agency of its own.
Right.
And of course, it's based on an interaction with the wind, but there is agency in all things, and leaves turning themselves to the sun, or just dealing with the wind, dealing with the environment. I mean, there's agency everywhere, and we have this anthropocentric idea of agency, that we are the only thing that has this spirit mind, rational ability to see things. And it certainly is a good exercise to step out of that once in a while and try to find another way to look at it. And that leads me to I've got I can think of at least one professor of evolutionary science that would say, I think he famously says, extended synthesis, no, we don't need that, right? Why do we need these new ideas? What is going to be different in how we do our work if we adopt some of these new ideas? Do you have any good comments?
That's the big question. I think that it's sort of an embarrassing situation at the moment, because if you stop someone in the street and ask them to tell you what they think is most distinctive about animals or any organism, they're definitely going to tell you a story that is full of agency, right? They're going to say animals, they do things. They everything that happens that is distinctive about them is connected to their agency. And yet, if you then look at the biological literature, that is not even. It's not that the question is not answered. It's just that it doesn't even come up, right? It's just we just do biology in a way that it seems completely disconnected from that experience, that observation, that sort of first-hand experience that we have with other living beings, right? Yeah. So that, I think, is an interesting starting point, right? Why is there this gap between something that everyone thinks is obvious and something that, if you ask someone what do biologists do, they would probably think they try to make sense of the agency of life. And yet then you look at what biologists actually do, there's nothing of that sort, right? I mean, we presuppose it most of the time, or we simply act as if it wasn't there. And I think that it is an unresolved issue in biology. It's an issue that has been recognized by some people for a very long time, but that I think we need to be comfortable recognizing that we don't have a good story about everything yet, and that there's work to be done. And I think that these many of the concepts and that are ideas that gravitate or that circle around this extended synthesis umbrella are precisely trying to do just that, right? They're trying to bring the organism back to the picture,
right?
The individual organism with its agency back to the picture of not just of evolution, but of development, of physiology, everything that the biologists study. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a very interesting question. It's one that we don't yet have a satisfactory answer. And as I say, it's often the case that you have to convince biologists that there even is an issue here to address.
Right.
Because it seems so alien to them.
Yeah, there's like the evolution of the genome and the idea that the gene constructs an organism.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, when you start studying embryology, you will lose that religion very quickly. You know, when you start understanding how the we were talking about mind here in the last few episodes over the last few months. And I keep saying that basically the beginning of mind is when the zygote first splits. Okay. And it doesn't only split, but it pushes out against whatever membrane is enclosing it. Okay. Mm. So the membrane is pushing back on it. And that's its first interaction with the external world, that first splitting of the zygote. Or we could draw a line there, of course. Like you mentioned in your book, that history goes all the way back in evolution too. So there is no real point where I start to exist and my mom stops, you know, that sort of thing. So there's all that. Mm. But anyway, you start looking at this interaction between the embryo and the other cells that have been created, you know, who that interactively message it, you know. Mm-hmm. And you're also looking at physicality, and you're looking at pressures and hydrostatic pressure about the membranes around it. And you can see that the gene just almost seems like if you go to a play and you have that little synopsis of the play, right, with the acts, that is not the play, right? The play is up there on the stage happening, and the genome is just that little synopsis, basically. Mm-hmm. So it has a very small part in it. Mm. So that's one way of looking at it. And then gene regulatory networks. Okay, we have the entire genome. And of course, ENCODE famously found out that about 80% of that thing is being transcribed somewhere in some cell type, right? So obviously we have a lot of little small molecules to large molecules that are being produced and probably don't have that mechanistic perfect function that we would talk about in a biochemistry book. Okay. So there's tons of other things going on that are just having very, very small, either deleterious or beneficial effects on that cell, on that organism. And that cell is its own being at that point, you know, because it has a membrane around it, and that makes it a self. And then, of course, it's next to a bunch of cells, and it makes an organ, and the organ has its own ego and self, and all the way up to us. But when you look at the mechanistic approach, you're going to miss all the other pathways in that gene regulatory network that aren't yet famous in our minds, right? And you're going to miss a possible cancer forming or a possible evolutionary step, you know, where we're going forward. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like I look at it as this vast network of interactions, the gene regulatory network. And then out of that, we've been able to find out the ones that we're going to print in a biochemistry book and say, oh, yeah, this is how ATP is charged, right? ADP turns to ATP. And we'll talk about that. But the reality is in that cell, that happens maybe 20% of the time or 40% of the time. And the rest of the time, there are other things going on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's like you are trying to investigate, and you can imagine some sort of perfect sphere, which is perfectly, there's nothing, it's just one thing. And the tools that you have to study it are tools that require you to look at individual parts of it, right? Or aspects of it. And so you are doing, in some sense, some sort of violence to the object of study but I mean, almost it's inevitable violence, because you can't take all the complexity in at once, right? So you think of molecular biology as it's defined, its limits are defined by its methods, and it's the only way, or for some people think that that's the only way we can learn anything about life, is if we if we hone in on a particular process, particular pathway, because otherwise it's just too intimidating, right? How do you make sense of that complexity? I mean, science proceeds traditionally, at least, through analysis. Analysis just means to break down in Greek. That's the original term of analysis, right? And that's what scientists do, or to make sense of the world most of the time, right?
Yeah.
So that works very well for systems or phenomena that lend themselves to decomposition in that way. But if you're dealing with an organism that has this sort of integrated nature, integrated organization, any attempt to decompose it is going to lead to its destruction. You're going to destroy it in the process. You're going to kill it, right? So you are engaged in this process of reconstruction in your mind, right? You look at the building blocks, the components. You try to make sense. You characterize those in isolation and try to make sense of what each of them does. But that's a mental activity, because in real life it's always integrated. And the problem is that if you only consider the individual units or pathways or whatever on their own, you are very likely to miss the influences of all the other parts of the system that are not there, because you're dealing only with that, with those components in vitro, right? So there's always this gap between sort of this reductionistic approach and the experience of the system as it lives, as it exists as a whole. So this is, I think, a big problem, right? In terms of what we can know and how we can learn about life. And this is a very old problem. I mean, it's been recognized for centuries. It's not a new worry. It's a worry that goes back to the emergence of modern science.
Yeah, and worse yet, when a person starts looking at one of these mechanisms in a laboratory, they can spend their entire life doing nothing but working on this one particular membrane channel, in a cell, and not see the whole picture. And but that's how we do figure things out, is by analyzing, cutting up, and finding these main mechanisms, and we find those main pathways through that gene regulatory network. But then at some point, somebody has to be stepping out and taking a look at the wider picture. Like, there's a chapter you have where I think they talk about cohesion.
Coherence.
Yeah, and cohesion is probably the point where multicellular animals began to happen. As soon as these catenanes and catenins and all of that developed in the genome, suddenly cells could stick together, and we could have communities of cells, and then we had interaction or whatever. But there's like in biology, we looked at the cell, and we looked at all the endoplasmic reticulum, the nucleus, and whatever. We looked at these membrane compartments. Well, in the last 12 years, a big thing has become something called biological condensates, which, like the nucleolus in the cell, is a biological condensate.
Yeah,
it's just a bunch of sticky proteins that have kind of created their own little sub-environment, right?
Yeah.
And so you go down, and we find even new organelles that don't even have membranes, and we might miss that if we never step back, or we may be able to progress faster if we had more of a complexity view of life from the top.
Yeah, I'm happy that you mentioned the biocondensates, because to me that's probably, if I had to name only one, that to me is probably the most exciting development right now in molecular cell biology.
Right.
So the discovery that you got liquid phase separation, you got these parts of the cell that behave in really weird ways, right? They seem to behave almost like liquids, right? But not just any kind of liquid. And it's almost as if we are discovering, we're discovering sort of a new state of matter that is of interest to physics in life, right? We don't know what the hell how to characterize many of these biocondensates, and they seem to be very important for regulation, for many of the functions of the cell. And I think it's very telling that this discovery just completely puts into tension this view that we have of clockwork in the cell, right? That the cell has got all these little circuits, and everything works very efficiently because everything is at the right place and doing the right thing, and you got all these clear relations of structure and function and associations. If it is the case that the cell isn't a piece of clockwork and instead is in some way liquid, in some sense has these new states of matter, or states of matter that are in between the solid and the liquid, then much of what we know, or much what we think we know about the cell has to be recast, right? I don't know how far that revolution is going to go, but I mean, if I were, as I say, to make a bet about what is most likely to to influence how we think about the cell the next generation or the next 20 years, I would put my money on the discovery of these biocondensates that I think are very interesting. How do we learn about how proteins act at school? We learn that they are like little machines, right? They're rigid. They have the reason why they are efficient in doing what they do is because there is a clear connection between structure and function, right? Enzymes are good, fantastic catalysts because the active site is such that it is able to catalyze the reaction very efficiently. If it turns out that most proteins, we're not just talking a few, but most proteins have intrinsically disordered regions and seem to not have a clear, definite structure, and they seem to be sampling stochastically different conformations, then we really need to rethink a lot of what we think we know about how the cell works. And that's exciting.
Yeah, and that again goes back to gene regulatory networks and how there are these standard ones, or the ones that are pretty obvious, that work most of the time and seem to be enough to support life. But then on the fringes, on the outer edges, okay, if we have some sort of biocondensate that forms in an area, suddenly the gene regulatory networks change,
right?
And there might be very small contributions that end up becoming really important afterwards. It's kind of like if you imagine a town in Oklahoma, and it's all laid out with pretty streets and everything. We got it all figured out, and there's a couple of factories, and then a tornado blows across, biological condensate, right? What does it leave in its path, and what happens? What changes as a result of that? What good and bad comes from that? But there's a whole lot of that going on in cells, and that tends to lead to some of the diseases that we have. But more than that, what we don't know about is what good things come of that, and what things are necessary for life to proceed.
Yeah. One thing for me that is very sort of conspicuous as a problem to solve is, how is it that the cell maintains its order? Right, because in the machine view, everything is ordered almost by definition. You got a set of a blueprint or a set of instructions that are encoded in the genome that are executed algorithmically by the machinery of the cell, and then so everything in the cell knows what it needs to do and when. Everything is in the right place at the right time, and everything works like a factory, like some sort of like clockwork. But if it is the case that physically speaking, that view is empirically inaccurate, this is not what's going on as far as we can tell from experiment, then we have something that wasn't a problem suddenly becomes a problem. How does the cell manage to do what it needs to do when it needs to do it? Right. Also, if you bring in basic physics, right, the physics of the microscopic domain, where that nothing can happen completely deterministically when you're talking about molecules, because molecules exist in a medium of chaos, stochasticity, as a consequence of the thermal agitation of molecules at any temperature above absolute zero, right? That's what we refer to as Brownian motion. At any temperature above absolute zero, at the molecular scale, you're going to have this random stochastic jittering of anything that exists, right, at that level. And so how can that sort of environment, which would be analogous to living in a hurricane, right? How can, in spite of that, cells find ways of exhibiting orderly behavior, right? And I think that the answer to that, or the beginning of the answer to that, has to do something with statistics, right? We need to rethink causation and how we think about how things happen, right? It's not the case that, as you see in a textbook, a molecule A, binds to molecule B, and then this leads to stage C in the reaction, and you don't. In reality, what you have is a bunch of molecules that are randomly moving about, but that you can statistically estimate that there is a high likelihood that certain things that the cell needs for them to happen will happen, right? And if you think about it that way, you think about it probabilistically rather than deterministically, then it also enables you to understand differences between isogenic cells. Cells that should behave the same because they're genetically identical, according to the mechanistic view, obviously don't. And empirically speaking, that's just a fact of the matter, right? And you can't theoretically explain that if you assume that the genome does indeed determine the structure and the behavior of the cell. If, on the other hand, you think that what you really have is, a stochastic system, then even if you have the same components in both cells, you are likely to find it is natural and expected to find that there will be differences between them, right? So something that is completely strange on one theoretical perspective becomes something that makes sense and is even expected from another perspective.
Yeah. This idea of this goes on to some of the philosophical discussions we've had. Recently, I kind of came down and said, well, numbers exist in objective reality or outside of us, right? The numbers are, real aspects of the universe. But I'm always trying to find, apparently we live in a space-time coordinate system, right? And there are particles in that space-time or fields, which end up at our level might seem like particles, like atoms and things like that, like condensates, right? And so things are in a certain place. And so there could be 2 electrons separated by 12 inches, right? Or 1 nanometer or whatever. But things are in a certain place. So matter in the universe naturally has to have some kind of pattern to it, right? So there's some relationship in patterns. And then when you step out, if you go out like 1 order of magnitude or 2 orders of magnitude and look at a different scale, you may find that same pattern, but now at a different scale. And what you're dealing with is some kind of mathematics of complexity and scale, or statistics and complexity. And trying to make, we don't seem to have the mathematical tools to talk about how 2 clouds can have areas that both make them look like your grandma, right? Or that there's this analogy between them. What is an analogy? And some people want to say, well, only brains do that. But no, I don't think so. I think that is complexity in the making, these patterns and how they form.
But Mike, first of all, perhaps some physicists would disagree with you that you mentioned electrons, that electrons occupy a given point in space, right? Because we have an understanding of electrons that seems to suggest that, often they behave as waves, and it's very difficult to say where a wave is. Right, yeah. And so it may be pushing against that idea that you can map mathematically the position of every single thing in the universe.
Right, but you got to admit that at some level, at some resolution, it becomes obvious that I am here in Minnesota and you're there in wherever you are, New York.
Yeah. I could even push back. Let's make the conversation interesting. So I think we need to start disagreeing with each other. Okay. Mm-hmm. So let's say I saying that's not quite right, because the whole point of this process perspective is to get us to stop thinking about us as discrete entities that occupy given points in space.
Right.
The wonderful thing about processes is that they are diffuse in that sense. You don't know. You were talking about clouds. Where does the cloud start? Where does it end? It has fuzzy boundaries, and we don't. That doesn't mean that they don't exist. It just means that we can't quite. That's maybe not the right question to ask. Where are the exact boundaries? And if you think you can actually think about most things in nature in that way. And that those things that look really fixed and static is because they're changing extremely slowly. But that what you actually find at all levels and at different timescales are just patterns. There are still patterns, as you say, but there is flow, right? it's like picking out waves in an ocean, right? The waves are there,
Right.
you're not making it up, but the waves don't have, they're not fixed, they're not distinct, they're not in a way modular or separate or autonomous from the environment in which they're embedded in. And one can make a similar case about any organism, right? Any organism exists only by virtue of the symbiotic ecological relationships that it maintains at any time with others, and so it's very difficult actually to. I mean, maybe I would even challenge, that you are there at a particular place right now, right? Which part of you, where, the question of boundaries is still an issue there, and also not just spatially but temporally. You mentioned this earlier. When did you begin, right? It's not clear from at a cellular level when is it that a new organism comes into existence, and it's all much more gradual.
Yeah, but you see there's a tension between those two things. Okay, there's a tension between finding that pattern or fixing that location. That's very similar to the reductive mechanistic, it does this, right? And then the overall kind of like more general reality of it, that it's all in flux. And it's all gradients, and it really is very difficult to find out where the cloud begins.
Right.
At some point, statistically, the cloud is thicker at some point. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so that produces a pattern, which is real in the universe.
Right.
Yet that pattern is deceptive in that it's got gradients that, flow. Right. So what I'm saying is that there's a tension between those two things, and that is the mathematics that I'm talking about that we need to understand that tension between complete homogeneous random, what we would call random, and something that is highly ordered, right? So there's a tension between those two things. And of course, if you add the time dimension, you got another area of fuzziness and, where things are going to degrade. And so it is in that tension that is the thing that I want to talk about between this homogeneous and this ordered sort of thing. And that's kind of what we're looking at in life. And that's what we're looking at in evolution. I tried to draw simple diagrams to explain natural selection to Danny from Phil Talk. You met him? Yeah. And I had a couple, like I had this little diagram. Well, I could show you what I did. If I happen to have a drawing pad here. Let's see, where are we here? But I came up with, oh my goodness, there it is. Okay. So I would start, with like, okay, we've got an organism, right, that develops, and it, develops right here, but here it reproduces and produces another organism, and then that develops and produces another organism, and develops and whatever, and you end up with this chain, right, of organisms, right? And I can make that a little bit bigger if you can't see it. And then I'm like, okay, but I have the problem that all of these, like there are multiple organisms in a population, and I don't know how to draw that on this diagram, but I got the idea that we, our adult cells after we've reproduced are kind of like mushrooms. We're kind of useless and we die off. And the important thing is the germline that's going through, right? And you're looking at the germline. But then you got the problem of, there's another problem.
But I would even say there it's useless according to what perspective?
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Right. That's according to, if you only are looking at the germline and you're only interested in the population genetic approach, right, then yes, then we're useless. But if you bring the organism back into the picture, organisms after they reproduce continue to affect the world that they live in and affect other organisms, right? So
there's going to be
strongly reject the idea that because that's just a genetic-centered perspective. But if you're thinking about ecology or thinking about physiology or behavior, then you're not going to be useless after you undergo reproduction.
Yeah, this orange line here could be, this orange arrow is parenting, right? And then we could have another arrow that basically is niche construction, right?
Exactly.
And then worse yet, we've got two organisms because we're sexual organisms, right? So there's that, we've got, so I mean, it becomes very complicated. And what I'm saying is that one of the things that we need is we need some better and different mathematics to explain what the hell we're doing, other than just raw statistics and genomics and bioinformatics. And we need a little bit more than that in order to take this and turn it into a model of a population. And it's a very difficult problem. And as soon as you start drawing these diagrams, and the only way that I can think to solve it is a combination of some sort of object-oriented programming, where you create models, and you keep making your models more and more complex, and maybe a little bit of AI and neural nets. But
I mean, surely this really depends on what questions you want answered.
Right.
Because I may not be interested in. I mean, you and I may differ in our interest, right? You may be concerned in what's going on at a population level over many generations, because you may want to address over many generations if you want to address an evolutionary question. But if I want to address a question about microbial ecology, or even a question about physiology or development, then I'm going to be concerned just with one of those green lines. I'm not going to. It will still be a complex story, but it really depends on what it is that you want to answer. And I think that there isn't a single mathematical model that is going to give us everything we want in biology. It really depends on whether you're interested in populations, or whether you're interested in individuals, whether you're interested in what's going on within a single life cycle or single generation, or whether you're interested in what's going on across many generations. And that's precisely why you have to abstract away everything that you're not interested in. That's why when you look at population models, they tend to abstract away the organism and have no agency, because that's not what you're looking at, right? So everything is sort of reduced to the genotype. I mean, and even the language that we use, we talk about gene frequencies, or even the concept of diversity or variation. These are notions that imply a consideration of large numbers, right? But if you're looking at one organism, these are none of this is relevant. So everyone is in some way abstracting away 99% of reality in doing what they're doing. And I think we need to give up the project of coming up with something that applies to everything and will satisfy everyone's sort of epistemic interests and projects.
Yeah, for population genetics, okay, this model and extending that model and trying to build a better, more detailed model, a more overall model. In other words, bringing in more of these other areas and being less reductive but being more constructive allows you to go out and to drop out a level and then come back in with a different view of that, so that we end up with a different kind of reduction, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think reduction sometimes gets a bad rap, because reductionist models and approaches, there's the price that you pay for reduction is that you omit most of what's really going on, but you do gain focus, and you do acquire predictive power, say, in some models, right? So I think that reductionism is in some way inevitable. You can't just take in everything in a single moment. And if you think about it, we're doing that all the time, right? When you are, the act of perception itself is an act of selection of particular stimuli that you're going, then your brain interprets. You're not just taking everything in. Maybe we should. I'm a little skeptical of this idea of coming up with some sort of grand unified theory, because, I mean, science is epistemology. It's not ontology. Science, there's going to be a gap between reality, which is endlessly complex and nuanced, and we are going to be, all of us, picking out different aspects of reality for certain purposes, right? Now, of course, we want our epistemology to correspond as far as possible with our ontology, with reality, but it's like confusing the map with the territory. I mean, the map is never going to be the territory. In fact, you don't want it to be the territory. I mean, a perfectly accurate map that was perfectly to scale would be a really useless map. Think of a map of a city that was one to one, right?
It would be the force itself, right? Yeah,
exactly.
I mean, so force, right?
Exactly. So the whole point of a map isn't to, I mean, all you need to do is remind yourself that the map isn't the territory. Don't confuse the ontology with the epistemology. But I mean, I think it's perfectly fine. And depending whether you are interested in one thing or another, you'll have a different map of the territory, right? One that focuses on different things. So, so I think this also speaks to what you were saying about mathematics and reality. You were saying that before.
Yeah, mathematics actually falls out of reality, and it's about this, this total random space here, right? And the tension between that and the patterns that actually fall out of that, like these are a little more clustered than these over here. But if you apply that to biological membranes, we got a couple of cells right here, right? And then we got a nucleus, and then we can go a little bit further and we can draw some of these biological condensates, which are, fuzzy and whatever. And then, of course, you're looking at the organ on the outside of that, and then you're looking at the organism, and then you're looking at the environment. And there are all these different ways to, but the fact of the matter remains that there is something that is a nucleus, and membrane, and we want to be able to pick that out. But to use your map analogy, if we were used to, like, we were a tribe who had a very ill idea of geography overall, but we told people how to get somewhere by turn at the tree, take 10 steps after the cow, that sort of thing. And then all of a sudden we could rise up above in a helicopter and see that entire terrain. We would get a different idea about how to draw maps.
Right.
Okay. And so what we need in biology is we need to hover up with a helicopter to a wider view of these systems, like membranes and localities, and get a different idea of what's going on, and then come back down and then do our reduction. So I'm saying,
I mean, obviously, the higher up you go, to use your analogy, obviously, the less defined is what you see, right? But so there's always a price. There's a price you pay, and also obviously the further in, the closer you get, the more clear everything is. But in some sense, you are more likely to ignore the environment. Yeah,
you could be an expert navigator in this tribe, hailed above all others as the greatest navigator of all time, and not realize that you were living on an island.
Right.
And so what we're looking in biology is this kind of greater overview of the system, and some mathematics to deal with that. Some mathematics to deal with how complex it is, how order arises out of chaos, that sort of thing.
So you'd say that mathematics is sort of indispensable for acquiring an explanation of what's going on in nature, including life?
Yeah, there's different, we have just gotten started in mathematics. We need something much more, and I think category theory is one avenue to that, and maybe some bizarre geometry or something. But there are other ways that we can deal with these problems of complexity and some new mathematics. The one thing that seems to fall out of all reality is mathematics. I mean, that sort of gives you a structure for all of this, these little droppings, right?
It's an interesting question. I mean, it's an interesting question. I'm not sure. I mean, I don't think that.
I'm not either.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very common view, right? So Immanuel Kant in the 18th century argued that there's only as much science in any science as it contains mathematics.
Yeah.
So sciences, they reveal to us how primitive they are by the fact that they don't yet have mathematical sort of models included in them. And I don't know if that's quite right, because I actually think of mathematics more as an epistemic tool than as something that is, there's sort of the Pythagorean or Galilean view that you seem to be expressing, right? That reality is mathematical in some sense. We're discovering the structure of reality by using maths. I mean, I think that if you look at what mathematical models do in the sciences, they're often abstracting away and idealizing. So philosophers like to distinguish abstraction from idealization. Abstract models simplify by omitting information, but they still try to give sort of an isomorphic correspondence. They respect the sort of correspondence between the reality and the model. Idealized models are those that are introducing assumptions that you know are wrong deliberately, like when you talk about an infinite population in the Hardy-Weinberg
Right.
ecological model, right? You know that there's no infinite population, or that that mating is never random. I mean, in the Loth-Cabot terror, but that's fine because it's a model, right? And so you think of think of in economics, right? Think of how we use mathematics or in the social sciences. It's all an attempt to find some sort of order or pattern in an extremely complex system, right? And we don't really know what's going on because when we use statistics in those cases, we're not tracing causation, so you don't really have an account of what's happened, and yet we don't seem to need it, right? The beauty of statistics is that it can give you predictive power without causal understanding, right? That's a really interesting thing philosophically, right? How statistics works in that way. You don't know what's going on, and yet you can predict what's going to happen. So if you take that idea and run with it, it's less clear that the degree of the advancement of a science is reflected by the amount of mathematics in it, because mathematics are usually in many cases are just abstracting a lot of stuff, and they're giving you accounts that are in themselves, they're not strictly speaking true because they're simplified. I mean, that's even in physics, right? You never have only two bodies. Your Newtonian mechanics, Newton's laws work really well if you have two bodies. The moment that you add a third one, then everything becomes infinite and complex, right? Yeah. So some philosophers have even argued that all mathematical laws in some ways are lying. Nancy Cartwright has this book called How the Laws of Physics Lie. Double entendre. I mean, how they underlie everything, but also how they lie to us because they are giving us idealizations, very useful idealizations, mind you, very helpful, but they don't reflect reality. And if that's the case, then I don't see how you can defend what you're saying, right? That you have this mathematical, that we need a mathematics that reflects, there's this correspondence between the complexity and our mathematics.
Yeah, I don't think you're never going to get an all-encompassing mathematics. Because, when you model stuff, you must reduce it in order to model it, right? If we had a mathematics that explained the universe, it would have to be bigger than the universe. So we're never going to get there. But what I'm saying is we need a little bit more, especially around this area of how patterns form. And some of it is statistical. Now, population genetics, for instance, that infinite population. Yeah. If you have an infinite population, nothing could ever evolve. Really, right? I mean, yeah, because it would never fix in the population, right? So you'd never have and creationists have famously used this as an argument against evolution, that it would take 800 billion years for one trait to fix in an infinite population or a nearly infinite or whatever. So I mean, there's always these problems with the models. But what I'm saying is that there is some meta mathematics that needs to be done that can give us better clues about some of this biological complexity and give us an overview from which we can then descend back into our reductive madness. But
I mean, what about conceptual understanding, like acquiring? I mean, why is it that we should ascribe to mathematics this privileged role in how we think about what constitutes a good scientific explanation? So I think a lot of that is coming from a physics bias in science, that in physics, it does seem to be the case that you make a sort of you bring together explanation and prediction. You assume that a good explanation is one that gives you a prediction, and a good prediction is one that in principle gives you an explanation. And if you can't predict something, then you haven't understood it. And if you haven't understood it, then you can't predict it. I mean, that really, when you think about biology and you think about organisms, do we really want to say something like that, right? That the prediction is in some way the goal, right? That if we are able to predict how a population of zebras behaves, that we have an understanding. I think that doesn't really work. That
kind of pragmatism not only bores me but disgusts me because I'm talking about something else. Okay, like mathematics, like if you look at a pattern in a cloud, you can apply trigonometry to those patterns, and you can start to see all the triangles, right? You're going to learn something about that cloud, but you have not looked at the entirety of the cloud. You don't know the noumena or the reality of that cloud, but you are able to see something that's actually there. There's actually a relationship, right?
Right.
And then you could extend that and go maybe into some kind of category theory, and you're looking at the difference between or the relationship between a calculus of clouds and a trigonometry of clouds, and you're going to come up with a different conception, because I think essentially concepts are mathematical.
Really?
Yeah, I think so.
You'd say the concepts, biological concepts, are mathematical.
Well, I think I think how we create concepts is essentially mathematical. Okay, in a very, very general and loose sense of mathematics, structural, looking at geometries or whatever. So our conceptualization is a mathematical treatment of something. We see analogies. We relate one pattern to another.
For me, I mean, I don't see it that way at all. I think that concept formation is an act of metaphorical redescription most of the time. So the way scientists generate new concepts is by comparing this thing that they're looking at, the unknown phenomenon, and seeing it through the prism of something that they already know, right? And so what you have is what is referred to as a metaphorical redescription, right? And if you look at how scientists talk, they do this all the time. You need some sort of language to describe something new, and in order for others to understand what you mean by what you want to say, you draw on analogies, you draw on metaphors. That's why metaphors are so fundamental to science, right? And metaphors play a really important role, because they're not just there to sort of as ornaments, to aesthetic ornaments to make something sound nicer, but they are fundamental to the process of cognition. When you conceptualize something new by, not always, but most often by drawing on some sort of framework or perspective that you already have, and I don't think it's mathematical in nature, at least not in the life sciences.
That's what I'm calling mathematics, is metaphors and analogies and things like that. So I think I have a much wider view of mathematics of what you're talking about.
Okay.
That is mathematics, basically. This process of metaphor and analogy, and there again, you have this you have this homogeneous or seemingly random thing, and all of a sudden you start finding patterns in it, right? And then you look at it from a different angle, and you're going to find very different patterns and different metaphors and different analogies. And you can step out of the level and come up with a more like a mathematics of that process, right? Of these two different, and that is category theory in mathematics, basically, which I don't understand. I understand very weakly.
This is the sort of mathematics that Robert Rosen uses, right?
Is it Robert Rosen? I'm not sure if I'm not familiar with that name.
Yeah, so he's one of the forgotten sort of authors of theoretical biology. He was student of Rashevsky, developed relational biology, and he wrote this well-known book called Life Itself, which has a great beginning and a great ending, but like 90% of it in the middle is incomprehensible mathematics, and I think most of it is couched in terms of category theory.
Right. Is that let's see, the professor of biophysics at?
Yeah, he died in the 90s. I'm surprised. It's a pretty well known.
He died fairly young.
This is the book I'm talking about, Life Itself.
Life Itself. Oh my God, no, not on my radar. But anyway.
Yeah. So a lot of it is actually, I think, as far as I recall, I don't understand the maths either. So I have to take him at his word when he's sort of providing the mathematical demonstrations for the philosophical conclusions. I'm more interested in the philosophical conclusions. He's well known for actually suggesting that there is no, actually for this, he shares my, or I share with him this sort of conviction that organisms can't, are quite different systems from mechanical systems, from machines. We should not try to, I mean, that's a metaphor that's gone wrong.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, we've gotten way out there, and probably bring it back with this question from J. Mike. Have you asked Dan what he thinks about Fodor's objection to natural selection, given intentional extensional context? So, what do you think of Fodor, Jerry Fodor's?
Yeah, I don't. To be honest, I never really paid so much attention to that. I mean, if you want to remind me of the objection, then I can tell you my thoughts. But I never really engaged.
Danny touched on it with your interview on Phil Talk.
Okay. Yeah.
And that was back in September 25th, 2021.
Yeah.
And it was basically I think the idea was that natural selection and evolution is just historical contingency. And that we're just coming up with a story about, what happened historically. And of course, I wouldn't deny that. But he was saying that there is no way to create these laws or mathematics of population genetics or whatever they're going to tell us anything. And he was basically saying that natural selection wasn't possible. And oh God, I hate to get back into that today, but we have been in and out of that so many times. And I think the objection was pretty weak. I think his case was very weak. But Danny likes it.
This idea about contingency is, I think, really important, right? I don't think you can understand.
Oh, yes.
So that's really important, and it has huge implications, by the way, on biological knowledge, the nature of biological knowledge, right? In the philosophy of biology community, there is this consensus that there are no laws of biology.
Yeah.
And the best argument was given by a philosopher called John Beatty in 1995, published this very famous paper called the Evolutionary Contingency Thesis. That's the name of the paper. Great article, really good to get students to discuss it in class. And what he argues there is that laws that you find in biology are one of two kinds. They're either really physical-chemical laws in disguise; they're not really distinctively biological, he says.
Right.
Or they describe contingent outcomes of evolution. And if it's the latter, and they describe contingent outcomes of evolution, there's nothing necessary about those generalizations, because evolution could have always been different. And one of the things that we associate with the notion of natural law is this notion of necessity, that things have to be the way that are described by the law. Yeah. So he argued in this way, quite nicely, right, that that's the reason why biologists don't deal with laws. It's because it's expected that all biological generalizations have exceptions for that reason, that things could have been, that contingency lies at the very heart of biological reality, because biology is historical and history doesn't follow laws, right?
Right.
I mean, most historians will agree, unless you find some Marxist or Hegelian historian. Most historians think that there is no sort of teleology or no sort of rules that govern historical processes, and that you can't generalize. Historians are notoriously skeptical of drawing generalizations from one historical event or case study to another. And philosophers, of course, are on the other side of the spectrum. Philosophers love to make generalizations. This is actually a really interesting question about how contingency affects biology, and the question about whether it affects, whether that is what makes biology also different from either from chemistry or physics. If you have other natural sciences that are very much, structured around laws, is that because physics and chemistry do not have that sort of contingency that you have in the subject matter of biology? So this is a big debate in the philosophy of science.
Yeah. There again, you have that tension between something that seems law-like in biology, like natural selection, that we can use to model ideal populations and seem to come up with some idea about what actually happened historically. But then if you went back and looked at, if you broke it down to every atom hitting every atom and every, ecological niche and meteorites hitting the earth and all of the complexities, you're going to understand that it didn't have to be that way. But you did find something, some sort of seeming law-like behavior in natural selection, that allowed a population. And then when you break it down and you look at hell, I mean, it's just, it is trivial that the fittest is going to survive, or the thing that reproduces the most is going to end up designing that population in the future, right? Or it's going to end up, I hate to use the word design, but so I mean, it's that tension between finding those law-like behaviors and then looking at the reality of the chaos that's really involved. And it's almost like an approximation, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And that's where mathematics usually comes in, as approximation.
Right. You've got an approximation that works for a while, and then all of a sudden it goes off. Well, if you're looking at populations and you're looking at very large populations, and then all of a sudden you've got an anomaly. Well, you got an anomaly because you had a bottleneck, because a raft broke off, and you had like 10 individuals on that raft, and they went one way and the other. And it's just that I wouldn't come down on any one side of that disagreement, right? Both things are true. And it's a matter of finding out why both things are true and in what interesting ways they are true. Yeah, that both things can be true.
Yeah.
So I don't love arguing with Danny about that, but I do love bringing that whole 4-door thing up every now and then when I have a lot of energy, but often don't. So how long ago did you write the book on processual biology?
How long?
Yeah, how long ago was that?
How long ago it was published? I think late 2018.
2018. Okay. Yeah, that's a pretty good book. I've been going over bits of it here and there. There's a lot of really good papers in there. So
yeah, it was part of this big project that I was involved in, and we were a team of like 5 people. We were meeting every week to sort of discuss these questions, and the book was a product of one of the conferences that we organized. It's an interesting thing, this process perspective, because it's almost like a Gestalt switch. You learn to see everything differently when you make that switch.
I think in theories about consciousness, like what is consciousness, we necessarily end up consciousness does not exist at a point in physical time. It exists as a swath of time. So our minds somehow are they're little historians. And the consciousness level happens within a window of about 200 microseconds to 3 seconds, where we take a swath of time and we gather together history, and that is our consciousness. And we could not be conscious in a moment. We can only be conscious over a swath of time. Right.
In the same way, you can't be alive at a moment.
Right. It's
if everything, if we could stop time and some alien came to observe it, or maybe not, anyone would observe it, that they would not be able to tell the things that are alive from those that are not, right?
Well, I understand that you can do that by diving into a vat of liquid nitrogen.
Right.
Yeah, you can stop time. Basically, you can get down to that moment in time, that moment of your life, right? You can experience that moment if you dive into a vat of liquid nitrogen and freeze yourself solid. Of course, we all know intuitively that you would no longer be conscious if you did that.
It's interesting how in those cases what we're doing is we're connecting something temporal to something spatial, and what is spatial is motion, right?
Yeah.
What we were talking about before. What happens when you cool things down really a lot is that motion, there's less motion, and at absolute zero there's no motion. So it's kind of interesting to think of how time and space coalesce in that way.
And that gets right down
the way we even define time is in terms of change, in terms of movement. I mean, that's Aristotle's definition. I mean, it seems quite apt. It's very difficult to explain to someone what time is without also bringing up the notion of change and the notion of movement, motion.
And then the interesting thing about humans in particular is we drag our entire history of our lives with us. They're all part of that undocumented terrain that lies just below our consciousness every day. And we have our entire histories, and we have these stories about our past and who we are and all of that. And so that kind of, there's this Graham Harman. Are you familiar with him? An object-oriented ontology, basically. but they got heavily into I don't know if it's Husserl or they got heavily into objects, right? And that objects were real in the universe without man, and objects, again, what I'm talking about, like an object, like a table, which is a collection of molecules, right? But it is a thing. And they were looking at,
just very quickly to say, I mean, it's a thing from our perspective, right?
Right.
Because a physical description of the table is one where there is no,
right.
It's not solid. It's mostly empty space. I mean, if you want to talk really about what's actually there,
yeah,
a table is mostly empty space from a physical perspective, right?
Yeah.
So we are always bound. You know, it's a very dangerous thing to do, but we do it inevitably to project our own perception on things onto the world itself, right? A table looks like a table if you happen to be like us, right? But if you, if you existed at a different scale, or it wouldn't look necessarily, it wouldn't have the attributes that we afforded to it, right? It wouldn't describe it as smooth and it resists you. Yeah.
Nevertheless, we are in reality, and we have a relationship with that table, right? And so we have a particular perspective that is our relationship to that table. And that
we have more than one perspectives, I would say. I mean, Eddington.
You could walk around the table and get a very different perspective. Or
no, I mean something more fundamental than that. So when talking about the table, I'm reminded of Eddington, this early 20th century physicist. He's got this very nice book, The Nature of the Physical World, and it's become very famous because he begins these are lectures about physics. Eddington, of course, is the guy who went to the tropics to provide empirical support for Einstein's theory by looking at whether it really was the case that light coming from a distant star was bent as it got close to the sun. Okay. So he, in the 1919, he organized an expedition to the tropics to find out whether it really was the case that the sun was bending the light coming from a distant star before it got to us, as Einstein had predicted, because no one thought that was, plausible, and it turned out that was the case. So anyway, in this book, he actually begins by talking. He begins by talking about the table that he has in front of him, and he says, if you ask anyone to describe, so let me just read you from the beginning of the book. I have settled down to the task of writing these lectures and have drawn up my chairs to my 2 tables. 2 tables, yes, there are duplicates of every object about me. 2 tables, 2 chairs, 2 pens. One of them has been familiar to me from earliest years. It is a commonplace object. It has extension. It is comparatively permanent. It is colored. It is substantial. It is a thing. And then table number 2 is my scientific table. It is a more recent acquaintance, and I do not feel so familiar with it. It does not belong to the world previously mentioned. My scientific table is mostly emptiness. Sparsely scattered in the emptiness are numerous electric charges rushing about with great speed, but their combined bulk amounts to less than a billionth of the bulk of the table itself. It supports my writing paper as satisfactorily as table number 1. So, he starts the lectures talking about what later Wilfrid Sellers would refer to as 2 images of the world or any entity, the manifest image and the scientific image, right? And he says, look, the everyday, what you were describing a moment ago about the table would be the manifest image, how the table presents itself to us in our everyday experience, right? Yeah. The interesting thing about science is that science gives us a very different image of the objects that it studies, right? If you ask a physicist to describe the composition of the table, the description is going to look completely different from the manifest one, right? So it opens all kinds of fascinating questions, which I guess we don't have time to get into. But my point with regards to what you were saying is that we can't just assume that the table exists just as it appears to us, because you're just describing the manifest image of the table.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's there's a whole other discussion there about what we're trying to do by getting in, by making it more objective and less personal.
That's exactly right. So many people would say, I mean, that's the philosophical sort of view that comes out of this, that the manifest image is inherently subjective and it's first person. So when you describe a table or you describe anything, you describe your experience of the sun, you're going to you describe it in ways that relate to your experience, okay? And then you have another way of describing the table or any object or a clock or or the sun or anything, scientifically speaking, which is supposed to be objective, is supposed to be sort of third person. It's impersonal, right? It's a description that does not presuppose us being in the world, right? And actually, it can be quite useful to think that every time you talk about something, there is this manifest way of talking about it, and there is a scientific way. And you may ask, what is the connection between these two images?
Right.
Should science give us a way of returning to the manifest image? Which one is the real one, right? Is the manifest image, is the scientific image the only one that really exists, which is actually Eddington's position? He says, the table as it exists is the physical description of the table.
Right.
I don't agree with that. I mean, I think that it depends on what
I would agree with him.
One perspective, right?
Well, I would agree with him to a point. So I'm going to check in him. But like what I was beginning to say about object-oriented.
Yeah, sorry, I took you in a different direction.
And we went off on a tangent, but
sorry.
But that tangent is actually very, very appropriate because it's connected. The object-oriented, like when they look at the table, they also try to envision the entire history of that table. So the history of the objects all the way back to when the object, came together or coalesced. And so if you look at a building, like when I was reading this stuff, I managed to make a trip to my hometown in northeastern Minnesota. And I noticed there was a brewery there that had apparently been abandoned before I was born. And it had been turned into a welding shop, but it was just the most remarkable architecture. And I started looking at the buildings in this town, which I'd never really looked at before, as entailing their entire history. Every person that walked through it, every interaction it ever had. And this object-oriented ontology. And that kind of gets back to the processual idea of everything, where we're looking back, we're looking across time at things. Right. And basically looking at the flow from one thing, about how a thing flows from its conception to, its annihilation. And that becomes very interesting.
Absolutely, because I think we're not used to thinking in 4 dimensions, right? Especially, at least not biologists. Maybe physicists for the past 100 years, it's been inevitable, but that they do so in their training. But I mean, most biologists don't realize that at any point in time, they're only considering a time slice, right? A sort of a static snapshot of something that is constantly changing. One concept that blows people's minds when they first hear of it is the concept of a temporal part, right? Which is interesting, right? So the idea is that just as you can describe spatially different parts of you got your head and you got your heart and your lungs. Existing in 4 dimensions means that you also have, you're also made up of temporal parts, right? The speed of yesterday is not the same as the speed of today, and the all like parts of the whole, the true speed that is the whole would be the one that accounts for who you are from the moment that you start existing to the moment that you stop existing, and that is the whole. So you're already thinking reductionistically, although it's a temporal reduction, not a spatial reduction, when you try to make sense of reality by only considering any entity at a particular time instead of thinking about how it changes.
Is that Joanna Seibert or Site paper?
Site, yeah.
Sites, yeah, okay. Yeah, I caught that one because that has some diagrams, and I love diagrams. So that was going to be my next read in the book. Is Joanna.
Yeah, I mean, but it applies to lots of things. If you think about it, like think of taxonomy or classification, right? Yeah. We tend to classify things or organisms. When you think of what an organism looks like or a particular species, you tend to have the adult stage of the organism in mind, right? The frogs, you don't think of the tadpole. You think of the adult frog as representing the frog. If you want to compare the frog to other species, you think about the adult. But why? I mean, that's completely arbitrary. The adult frog is only one stage in the life cycle that is the frog. I mean, what is the frog is the life cycle. It's not like the frog has a temporal trajectory. It's that the frog is that temporal trajectory. The frog is that sort of worm in space and time, right? And that if you only consider one part of it, then you're going to be proceeding reductionistically, which is not in itself bad, but it's limited. And we should be aware of the limitations that come with methods that abstract the temporal dimension, which is actually most of them. most methods that we use in science, that you're always trying to keep variables constant, right? Everything has to be kept fixed, except one thing that you want to look at, so that if it makes a difference. And usually, what is abstracted away is that complexity. It's not just the spatial complexity, but the temporal complexity as well, right?
She calls it leveled mereology, I think, or something like that.
Mereology is the study of parts.
Yeah, leveled
mereology. You can have spatial mereology, you can have temporal mereology, and it's a concept that we don't use in everyday language. This notion of a temporal part, but it helps you sort of understand what this process perspective can give you, right? A view where it becomes more apparent, right? And it also applies to questions about, you were talking about, specifically human questions, so things like human personal identity, like, what makes you who you are, right? If you realize that you are in time, you're extended in time, then whatever you say has to be consistent with who you have been and who you will become, as much as with who you are right now.
Yeah. What makes me think I know who I am?
Yeah. Right.
I'm still trying to figure that out.
Yeah. So
that's a pretty dim view. I'm 72 and I still have no idea. So good luck, guys. Good luck with that. Okay, what are we coming up on here? Hour and a half? Or are you?
I can talk for a little bit more. I need to, but yeah, it's up to you.
Maybe we should pay attention to chat here and see what's going on. I'm not sure. We have Nerdy Rodent, who's a wonderful computer programmer, apparently, with a hell of a dark sense of humor.
All biology is just physics, and all physics is just mathematics.
Yeah.
So that's interesting, because the statement that all biology is just physics is sort of different from the statement that all physics is mathematics, right? If mathematics is a tool, then the first statement is a reduction in space or in complexity in scale, but the second one is of a different nature. I don't know whether physicists would be happy with that description of physics.
I was going to bring those two things together. You were talking about the manifest image and the scientific image.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. And I was talking about the object image, that we have the object today, and I was looking at the historical perspective.
Yeah, right.
Well, when I go out and stand in front of an oak tree, molecular biology has augmented and enhanced my feeling of the oak tree, right? Because of what I know about what's going on. Like, I can almost imagine molecules and leaves, and I can apply my imagination.
Right.
And that historical ontology allows me to see backward in time and bring that richness into my current experience.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It becomes kind of a phenomenology of experiencing things at not just the complete present in the moment sensory experience, but also everything that your mind can do with that in terms of its historical past and its scientific reality, or as close as we can get to it.
Yeah.
So that ends up bringing you into a more intense experience, and that is what humans need. That is what humans do. That's basically what we're all about. We bring all of those things to the table. We bring our history.
Would you say then the goal, in some sense, is to reconcile the manifest and the scientific by bringing the scientific into your manifest experience of the world?
God, I don't know. Goal gets to pragmatism, but I would say that it is a pleasant thing to do. And not only pleasant, but it also gives you a new perspective on certain things. And kind of what we've been talking about since the beginning is the possibility of getting a new perspective on biology, right?
Yeah.
And basically, but this gives you a new perspective on just your everyday, ordinary experience.
Yeah. I mean, in the case of biology, right, the agency, which we started our conversation, would very much be part of the manifest image that we have of living beings, right? When we observe the cat chasing the mouse, or the plants, moving with the sun or whatever, right? And yet, right, if you look at the mechanisms that are described in molecular biology, those sort of notions that are so fundamental and primitive in our manifest image don't feature. So I think it's a legitimate way of sort of setting an agenda to say that in some sense the burden is on the scientist rather than on the burden is on the scientific image to do justice to the manifest image rather than the other way around, right? And if it is the case that agency seems obvious as a feature of organisms, then why is it that we don't have a good explanation of it, a good scientific account of it? And I think that there are one can tell a story about why that is the case. I mean, I think for me, if you ask me, I would say that it has to do with the dominant machine conception of the organism that has basically shaped biological thought since Descartes in the 17th century. I mean, if you think of the world as mechanical and everything in it as mechanical, then you're obviously not going to see agency, because machines are not inherently active. They're responsive, they're reactive. There's no inherent agency. So that question never really comes up in your mind as a scientist, if that is the model that you're using to inform your investigation, right? So yeah, I think that it's worth reflecting on how these two images, this phenomenological first-person subjective experience of the world, which you can't deny is real in some sense, right? It's real to you, at least. Like you experience it as something that is happening. And on the other hand, there's non-personal, shareable, third-person objective view that does not require us to be in the picture at all, right? The fact that water is made of H2O has nothing to do with human beings. It's got nothing. It's completely separate, independent, right? And should we care about only that view, right? I mean, I think that's also one way of thinking about how science differs and connects to other areas of knowledge. I mean, if you want to ask about how science is different from art or music, you could say, or literature, you could say that science is concerned with this view of the world that is impersonal, and whereas all art is inherently personal, right? It's all about what it means to be human, about the personal experience, right?
I hate that about it, right?
You hate that about art.
Yeah, so I think we ought to fire all the biologists and replace them with Buddhist monks and have them teach biology, right? So, like, you wouldn't find agency or autopoiesis in any high school textbook, or probably very few college textbooks. Would you find any mention of agency or whatever?
No, right.
So we should get rid of the biologists and hire Buddhist monks. And
no, I mean, I think the key is not to shy away from the fight, from the challenge of making sense of this naturalistically. I mean, I don't think we should just sit content, recognizing that these two completely inconsistent views. I think we need to grapple with that which we don't yet understand, be comfortable in our ignorance. We don't have a good theory of certain aspects of the world, agency being one of them in biology. But, that's what I was talking about with these people, these Goetheans. I mean, I think I was saying that it's worth using the resources of natural science to bring the manifest closer to the scientific.
Yeah, the tension between the two, and in the tension is a solution of sorts. Yeah,
right.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
But I've done that for, God, I think I did that when I was a little kid. I was a weird little kid. I spent most of my time on my belly in the forest looking at little tiny things. And I would always try to bring whatever I learned about science into my current experience of whatever I was seeing.
Right.
So my imagination was working as a microscope as I was looking at a tree or whatever. And I still do that today. Knowing a little bit more about cell membranes and cells is really cool, because I think it gives me a richer experience, right? And I keep trying to marry the two things together. So.
Yeah, I mean, something that is very much connected to that I've often wondered is if we were the size of E. coli.
That's what I did.
Would we have discovered the kinetic theory of gases and Brownian motion before gravity, right?
Oh yeah, right.
Meaning that if your world is one where certain things are more manifest to you, right? Yeah. Because if you exist at that scale, everything is, you see that movement. It is a much more important problem for you to understand as a scientist than gravity, because gravity at that scale is quite difficult to observe.
Right.
Because gravity, it's more obvious with a larger mass, right? And so there's a great level of contingency. We were talking about contingency before. There's also contingency in the things in how science has progressed. The questions that have become more relevant to us are those that are concerning questions that are pertinent to our scale, right? How we observe the tree. But if we could see cells, right, then maybe things would have happened quite differently. We would have developed certain areas of science would be more developed than others. I was trying to say,
yeah. The aliens might wonder why us humans are so concerned with this tiny little thin film of scum on this rock, right?
Right.
Like everything we think about in biology is in that thin little film of scum around a big rock, right?
Right.
And that's what we're obsessed with, right? It's like,
yeah.
That's what you're going to worry about. It's like, get a life. Anyway.
Yeah, it also connects to how our understanding of nature has changed over the ages, right? Through the ages. So if you look at sort of antiquity, especially in the West, like you got this notion of nature as being alive, right? Everything, we sit very comfortably in the world because nature is alive and exhibits the properties and features that we also exhibit in our own experience of ourselves, right? And then that gets completely eliminated with the mechanization of the world picture that takes place in the 17th century that gives rise to modern science, which in essence represents a rejection, a flat out rejection of that view of nature. That organic, sort of purposive, intuitive view of the world is replaced with one that is cold and dry and mechanical and more efficient and more deterministic. And it's kind of interesting to think about it because we go from a point where we were perfectly at ease in the world, at home in the universe, to use Kaufman's paraphrase Kaufman, but to a point where suddenly we are, we need to explain that, we need to justify our existence. How can organisms, living beings, exist in a world that is mechanical, right? And I don't think biology ever really recovered from that. I mean, 350 years later, physics did very well in accepting a mechanical view. I mean, until the end of the 19th century. But biology has never really recovered from having to make sense of life and all its features,
right.
When you consider life against the background of non-life, of lack of, it becomes much harder, to reconcile these two things. Yeah.
Okay, I saw Dr. Chris Thompson in the side chat and put a link out, and he came in immediately. So I don't know if you two have met.
No,
we have not. No.
Okay.
And I would put up my camera, but unfortunately, I left my webcam camera at home. And I'm in my office.
Nobody wants to see us anyway. So
no, it's true. Yeah, I'm not a particularly handsome guy. So
tell. Okay, I'm not sure if you know who Dr. Nicholson is, but you guys could introduce each other to yourself.
Right. So I was just looking a little bit at the blurb of your book. So I'm not familiar with your work per se. I'm a neuroscientist, and I've gotten to know steam from debating creationists and intelligent design people online. And so this is something that I've gotten involved with. But I'm a neuroscientist. I'm very interested in topics around, my specific research is on brain development and how hormones regulate brain development. But I've gotten more and more interested in this issue around consciousness and how do we explain consciousness. And, I was looking at this whole idea that we're thinking about biology too much as just a system of static connections and not thinking about the process. And that very much figures into neuroscience. Now, I think within neuroscience, of course, we think about process to some degree, but we're not thinking enough about the epiphenomenon and emergence of certain behavioral properties that have to result from the fact that these are processes that are occurring in synchrony. And so this issue of consciousness, I think, actually really does flow from the fact that there are a series of processes that are interacting within the brain. And it's an emergent phenomenon. You're not going to find a brain area that is the consciousness area. It is the emergent phenomenon of these brain areas interacting that do sort of similar or sort of specific functions, but it's the process of all of them together, which I think is a fascinating idea. So I'm going to actually have to check.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. It reminds me a lot of this relationship between sort of mind or consciousness and sort of the materiality that is studied by biologists. Is in some way analogous to how biologists think of life in relation to the cells, and it's always been a terrible disaster when someone has tried to locate life in a particular entity or something that is static,
protein, right? Or a series of proteins that interact with each other.
Exactly, right? Yeah, but I mean, there's still I was going to say that the popular discourse still is, right, that DNA is life, right? If you ask most people, there's sort of, because there's something it's almost irresistible in the idea that you have one molecule that is fixed that basically defines who you are. Absolutely. I mean, it may be empirically really problematic and inconsistent with what we know, but as an idea, it sort of captures people's imagination.
Right. Yes. Yeah. And it happens so often that within even amongst biologists, professional biologists or professional neuroscientists, we get tightly wedded to a specific mechanism, and thinking about how this protein interacts with this protein, or this thing does this, and that this is then going to explain this ultimate result of some sort of basic process, and thinking of it in isolation. And it's fine to break things down at that level, but they're forgetting about the interconnectedness that exists on the molecular level, the genetic level, and then at the behavioral level as well. So when you're talking about neural systems, the highly interconnectedness across the brain is something that it's a difficult problem to really gain a lot of traction on. Absolutely. But it's absolutely how we're going to explain these more complex phenomena such as consciousness.
I think it helps. I was going to say, I think it helps to remind ourselves that, I mean, this is my take, that mechanisms don't really exist. Okay, so let me just explain this for a second. Mechanisms are very effective ways in which we probe and interrogate a system, be it a brain or a cell or anything, right? So because what are mechanisms? Mechanisms are just parts interacting with each other in a way that seem to provide, so in a regular way, right? Sometimes in a predictable way, and so what it gives you to think of the world as being made up of mechanisms, particularly organisms, gives you a way of studying them, right? So you say, okay, well, I'm just going to spend my life looking at these interactions between these parts that together seem to make a mechanism, right? Right. But I think that to explain or to convey the limitations of that view, it helps to remind everyone, okay, that mechanism is just it's a metaphor, right? It's thinking of organisms as if they were machines, and the way that you identify the mechanism in a cuckoo clock or the mechanism in any other machine, right? And that's a very helpful, often a heuristically useful thing to do, right? To try to project onto this super integrated whole these parts, these mechanisms that then lend themselves to independent study, but that is an act that you are performing. It's an act of epistemic abstraction. And the trouble emerges, as it were, when we forget that it's an epistemic abstraction, and we assume that system is actually made of mechanisms that together make up the system. I mean, I'm sort of, I guess, in the minority view. Most people, I mean, I don't know, I wouldn't say I haven't done a study of scientists, but many philosophers of science like to think of mechanisms as some things that really exist out there. But I just think that that's a residue of this mechanistic worldview that we've inherited from the 17th century. That there is no reason to assume that mechanisms make up reality, they make up cells, or they make up the brain. It's a way of talking. It's a façon de parler. It's a way of describing what's going on in a way that enables you to abstract away all the intimidating complexity of the surroundings, both spatially and temporally. We were talking about this before you came in, right? How useful it is to abstract away and to simplify. Right. But that, the moment that you go from the idea that you're simplifying heuristically to learn a little bit about the system to thinking that you've understood the architecture of the system, I think that's where the problem emerges.
Yeah, and I think that accounts for the grand failure of searching for the neural correlate of consciousness, is they were looking for a mechanistic correlate of consciousness, and it isn't that kind of a question. Like, what is consciousness? It's not a question that's going to have the answer in a mechanism. Okay, like the 40 hertz, whatever in the thalamus, I think was one idea from about 20 years ago. And all of those things ultimately failed because it wasn't the right kind of answer.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's not even the right kind of question. I mean, what is a mechanism is a question that comes up everywhere in biology. Okay.
Right.
What is the mechanism? But the fascinating thing is, no one cares to define what a mechanism is. If you look at any textbook of biology, if you go to the glossary, you'll find, go to the M and you'll see metabolism, okay, definition. But there'll be nothing for mechanism because it's a term that it comes up in scientific practice. And if you ask a molecular biologist to define what a mechanism is, you're going to get a totally different answer than if you ask an ecologist or an evolutionary biologist, right? A mechanism of speciation, whatever that is, or the mechanism of an immune response is going to look quite different from what the mechanism of protein synthesis. It's just the way of talking that we've inherited from, from history, from mechanism as a worldview. Right.
And I might take devil's advocate here a little bit just to say that mechanism, and as you said, it obviously has significant utility, right? But as long as we have that understanding that this is a relatively simplified metaphor, that is just a piece of the bigger puzzle, and that you cannot consider that this is then the true explanation of the actual phenomenon we're actually trying to explain. It may be a piece of the puzzle, but the level of complexity that we see in biological systems is so extraordinary that it is, it's a Herculean challenge to try to piece it all together and explain it completely mechanistically.
Right.
And because of this process phenomenon, that things flow in from one thing to another, and that there's state changes that occur, and the level of complexity that's on top of that mechanism is so extraordinary that it's difficult to fully model completely with a simple mechanism. That's for sure.
Yeah,
I think that's the thing about consciousness.
I think that's right. I mean, and I think it's if you deprive scientists from mechanism, many will feel almost naked, right? They got nothing.
Of course, because we love to isolate variables.
Exactly.
We want to figure out how does this one thing influence this other thing, and then we try to eliminate as many variables as possible and seeing that influence. And then, of course, it rarely is ever. If you're looking for, say, correlation, causation types influences, you're never going to see 100%, or at least rarely are you going to see that. It's always then some sort of coefficient of variation that one variable explains the other. So, okay, now it's explained by 25% of this phenomenon. Well, there's still 75% that were unaccounted for here. And so obviously then there's other parts that we're just completely missing. And that whole process of just seeing biology as being much, much bigger than these isolated, one thing influencing another thing is something that a lot of biologists don't take into account when they're
absolutely. And also, sorry, go on.
In defense of mechanism, I want to point out that every Van Gogh masterpiece started out with a first brushstroke. Mm-hmm. It was made of individual brushstrokes, right? And that's kind of what we're doing. We're trying to come up with enough mechanism to get a picture of the whole. But the problem is that when you focus too much on each individual mechanism, you may miss the whole. You may miss the whole of the moon.
But Speed, is that a good analogy? Because no organism comes into existence from one of its parts.
Right.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Yes. That's a really big difference, right? An organism is a whole from the beginning. And there's a really fascinating history of how we should interpret what happens in development. Is it one cell dividing and you have one and then two and you've got like a population of cells, which will be the multicellular view? Or is it one organism that is internally partitioning and you always have one from the beginning to the end, right? I mean, both are correct because both they're just interpretations.
Like that little stick diagram that I drew. If you look at it horizontally, it's one thing, from one generation to the next. So.
Right.
Yes. And evolution of organisms is a great example because you can think of them very mechanistically. You can look at parts of organisms in a very mechanistic way, that there's certain machine elements to it. And of course there is. Like you can look at it and see that there's, they have to exist in a physical world where gravity exists, or swimming, there's going to be certain physical limitations that they have to manage in order and adapt to in order to survive and thrive. But these things don't exist in isolation. So even through the course of development, but also through evolution, if there's selection pressures on, say, some feature, allowing it to adapt to, say, a particular environmental change, that's not going to be done in isolation. It's going to influence the whole organism. And so, we can't talk about, like, say, the heart evolving independently of, say, the lungs or the circulatory system, or how that might affect the brain. Any change in one part is inevitably going to have a whole slew of other changes in other systems that is difficult to model and difficult to show mechanistically, but inevitably has to work that way. And you see this at the molecular level too. Things are so much more sticky. Speed, you talked about this, like, that we think of these molecules acting, this thing acting on another thing. It's not nearly that simplistic. I had a great conversation with one of my colleagues here at Virginia Tech earlier this week. He studies neuropeptides and how they work on, he's doing this new project where he's trying to identify new neuropeptides. And I was like, don't we kind of know them? And he's like, no, we barely know we know about 10% of the neuropeptides that work as neurotransmitters in the brain. We know that there are other genes that are neuropeptides, but none of them have ever really been fully investigated.
Right.
And then he revealed another thing to me, which is that even the ones that we do know, but certainly the ones that we don't, that they act on receptors, right, to initiate some sort of mechanistic process. And so they act as a ligand, so you call them an agonist. But he said that there's enzymes that will cleave just 2 amino acids from those peptides, these neuropeptides, and now they're no longer an agonist, and in fact as an antagonist. So the same peptide, just a small modification to it, now completely flips the way it works in the brain. So instead of it acting on a receptor to cause it to actually, like, do some sort of function, now it's flipping to something completely different. And those are things that you can't see, say, at, like, the genetic level, or even, like, say, if you're looking at, say, expression of a peptide using mRNA, you wouldn't see that because that's a post-translational modification. And that whole level of processing, he says, like, it's completely ignored in neuropeptide research. It's just crazy to me.
Because it makes it more complex, right?
Absolutely, yes. So they ignore that. Yes, right.
Everything that goes on after. Yeah.
Right,
I mean,
absolutely.
one way to express what you're saying is to incorrectly paraphrase Dobzhansky, and not say that that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, but that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of context, right? Yeah. And the context is shaping everything. Any characterization that you give of any entity that is existing in the biological, in the biological realm is going to be in many ways affected and shaped by the other, if it's a protein, by what other molecules it binds to, by when it is expressed and where it is expressed, and the pH and the salinity of the medium, and all kinds of other, the temperature, right? All these things are going to influence what's going on, and it makes prediction very difficult. It also makes the story much more complicated than the one that you get from this mechanistic picture, right? Which is so comforting and reassuring to see these arrows, to see these solid state circuits, but there is no solidity at that level. I mean, that's what I keep, reminding people, right? There is no. I just even don't like talk of circuitry and wiring, and there's no wiring. What wiring?
Sure.
No.
Even at the neural level, we'll talk about wiring, and sure, I would agree. Of course, there is wiring, so to speak. But the amazing thing about it is that, like many of the maps that you'll see of the brain, of course, that is going to be the typical brain that one might see. But any one individual does not look like that. There's actually substantial variability across individuals, and a lot of it depends upon their developmental experience. So, for instance, if someone grows up blind, they have an extraordinarily very different kind of brain structure than someone who is sighted. And it's not like that the visual system completely disappears. It just gets reappropriated for very different kinds of things. And so, that is a process that emerges from the whole process of living and having experiences. And then, the wiring diagram does not apply to all brains in any respect, even within a given species like a human being. So,
right. A real wake-up call is when you see they've done some 3D visualizations of very small parts of the cortex, the neurons and the synapses and how they're lined up. And there's like a little 3D cube that shows you what actually is there. It looks nothing like a wiring diagram. It looks more like a piece of head cheese. Have you ever seen those? I mean,
sure. I mean, I can look at that in even my own work. Like I see, I do imaging so the little icon that you see there is a little zoomed in view of a tadpole brain. So I work with tadpoles for my research. And I work with them because they are developing brains and they're entirely transparent. So I can look at individual cells within the brain in a live animal and watch it change over time. And I can see how like an individual neuron will grow and change and add synapses. And it's extraordinarily complex. It doesn't look like any kind of wiring diagram that you would see from an engineer, that's for sure. It looks really random ultimately. And obviously it largely is. And then through experience, it becomes more refined. And then you start to see the patterning that occurs. And that's what the lab that I came from, where I learned how to work with tadpoles, that's what they worked on. So there's like a level of randomness that's there. And then there's change that happens through experience to allow for, say, the retinotectal map to form in the brain. So there's going to be a map of the retina that comes, but it doesn't start that way. It has to come through experience that happens. And if you change that experience, you can change the map. And so, yeah, so it's incredibly complex.
Yeah. Yeah, another wake-up call is my friend bought me a cow brain for Christmas, and I dissected it after studying a whole lot of neuroanatomy. I'm like, holy shit, that was a different perspective.
Who the hell gets someone a cow brain for Christmas?
Yeah, he brought me a cow brain for Christmas.
That's so funny. That's so you. Oh my God.
Right.
It's hilarious.
Yeah, he walked in with a refrigerator case with this cow brain and said, "I got your Christmas present." We happened to be having spaghetti at the time, and somehow when I looked inside, it spoiled the spaghetti for me. So.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah. I hate to say this. This has been really interesting. So Dan, I definitely want to check out your book. I'm going to plug your book, even though I haven't really read it, but it really looks really fascinating.
Thanks,
I encourage everyone to check it out too. Yeah, I'm going to look at it. So I'll get a copy. And yeah, I have to run because I have to go to another meeting.
And Dr. Thompson has a YouTube site that I linked in the description, and you guys should get together. So
yeah, that'd be fun. Yeah, maybe we can have a conversation. Yeah.
Excellent.
I'll reach out. Okay.
Good
Got to run. Bye, guys.
Yeah, and I'm running out of neurotransmitters myself. So
that sounds reasonable. We've been going in almost 2 hours.
2 hours, yeah. That's kind of my limit. 2 hours, and I kind of turn into a pumpkin after 2 hours.
So are there any of we had this list of questions? Anything you want to address in the last few minutes before shall we call it a day?
Yeah, there's so much more. The work of Mike Levin, Evolution is History. Oh my God. Well, we covered cells as machines, a little bit on GRNs, Platonism and the philosophy of mathematics, but
talk about that a bit.
Yeah. Maybe we should do it again.
All right, sounds good.
Time. Okay. I hope this was enjoyable for you. And
it was wonderful. It was a really nice way to start the weekend. Actually,
I'm glad you met Dr. Thompson. He does wonderful videos, and he's fun.
I'll check him out for sure.
He's also involved in the fight against the never-ending fight against creationists and intelligent design people.
I was wondering whether we were going to get to that because, I don't have a great deal to say about the sort of photo view, but I do have a lot to say about, the notion of design.
Right.
How he used that in his book, The Black Box, Darwin's Black Box, and this notion of design and designer. So maybe we can talk about that another time because we could maybe invite some of the creationists to discuss with us these questions.
If we could get a creationist, or we could invite Dr. Thompson or
sounds good.
Dr. Dan is another one. There's a few people we could invite, but it would be interesting to talk about this intelligent design. And this idea about machines, it never made any sense to me. The analogy never made any sense to me.
Right.
But they are
so central, though. If you get rid of that, you don't have really a discussion. For me, at least, the way I read this debate, this new sort of creationist debate, is one where you are reappropriating Paley's mechanistic view of the world, which stems from Descartes, right? Yeah. And trying to argue that the scientists are themselves mechanistic, and so it is the scientists that are being inconsistent in, on the one hand, appealing to machine models in the way they think about the biological world, and on the other hand, refusing to recognize the existence of a designer. If there's design, there's designer. So this could be, an interesting thing we could talk about. I'm sure you've discussed it many times in your in your channel.
Yeah. Well, maybe we'll do that next.
Sounds good.
Okay, guys, we're going to shoot it in the head, which is my version of ending the stream. I'm sorry, I apologize, but okay, we're going to end the broadcast. So, goodbye, cruel world.